Again, hello, my name is Ken Johnson. Welcome to our 7th Time for Action webinar, and thank you for joining us. My colleagues Kathleen O'Hara, Rolly Montpellier, and I are coming from you from the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin peoples in the Ottawa area. This week's webinar is going to be a little different. Today, we're delighted to have two very experienced and very savvy Canadian climate activists, Adam Scott and Patrick DeRochie. They are the dynamic duo at a relatively new climate NGO called SHIFT, which pushes on action for pension wealth and climate health. They will make a presentation for about 30 minutes. Then Rolly and I will ask questions based some of our own questions plus questions from the Q&A. Please put them in your questions in the Q&A. And then we'll finish by talking a bit about next week. Kathleen, our interviewer, has been promoted by Time4Action's board of directors to senior executive producer and senior vice president of strategic operations, Eastern Regional Programming Services. So today she will just be on the call, but she won't be asking questions. Actually, to be fair, she's only acting in that position at this time. Now I'd like to introduce our guests more formally. Adam Scott is the director of SHIFT. He has extensive domestic and international experience in policy, energy, and finance, as well as campaign design and execution. At SHIFT, he works with wide-ranging stakeholders to bring international climate leadership into Canada's financial sector. Previously, Adam was a senior advisor to Oil Change International and manager of the Environmental Defence Canada's Climate and Energy Program. And I met Adam at a CanRac meeting after he'd given just a great talk on about 3 years ago on Oil Change International's newest report, where they were basically saying 80% of the fossil fuels that had been already found had to stay in the ground. And then we had a several-hour beer-induced conversation that evening that was a delight. He's extremely knowledgeable, and I'm really happy to have him here today. Patrick DeRochie is SHIFT's pension engagement manager. He is focused on building a network of pension beneficiaries in Canada who will invest in their retirement savings in a zero carbon future. Previously, Patrick was climate and energy program manager with Environmental Defence Canada and a political organizer with SEIU Healthcare, one of Canada's largest healthcare labor unions. Thank you for joining us, and over to you, Adam.
Great, thanks for having us. Both Patrick and I are coming to you from Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And I'm just going to pull up and share my screen here. And hopefully everybody can see it. There we go. Yeah, and we're going to run through quite a lot of material in a short period of time. We're going to go through a presentation, and this is a rough outline of what we'll cover. But first, I'll quickly introduce SHIFT, just so you understand who we are a little bit better. So SHIFT is we're a small nonprofit project funded by charitable foundations, and we're really focused on helping Canadians engage with their pension funds on the climate crisis. And the reason we built SHIFT and the reason we exist is because finance is this critical and overlooked area of climate action. There's no way that we're going to be able to address the climate crisis at a global scale if the capital that's being invested around the world isn't directed towards climate solutions and being moved out of the causes of the problem, fossil fuels. So, for average Canadians looking for a way to have a huge amount of impact day to day, it's incredibly important that you think of ways in which you can influence where this capital is flowing. And one of the best opportunities for Canadians is to actually engage constructively with your pension fund. And all working Canadians are members of at least one large public pension fund. And yeah, we're here to help you take the leap and to actually do that engagement and to shift them. Canada's largest pension funds are actually the largest pool of capital in our country. We're talking about nearly $1.8 trillion in the 10 largest funds alone. So we'll get more into the details of that, but that's what SHIFT is all about. and we're really here to help facilitate Canadians to make that shift. So yeah, this is the rough outline of the presentation we're going to give. I'm going to sort of do the first couple sections. We're going to do a quick recap of climate science and sort of why we're here, and a bit of the context, which is really important for the conversation. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the financial risks and opportunities that come with climate change. And that's really critical in the context of shifting finance and shifting pension funds in particular, because pension funds are legally required to invest in the best long-term interest of their beneficiaries. And in doing so, they interpret that to mean that they can't lose money. Their job is to actually make sure that they can continue to pay out benefits long-term. So understanding the financial risks of climate change and the opportunities as well are critical for having them understand what their obligations are here. We're going to talk about how the world of finance is really changing rapidly around climate change and how there's a lot moving on this file. And then Patrick's going to jump in and we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive on Canada Pension Plan today to sort of look at what they've done so far on climate change and all the things they haven't done, looking at their investments. And then we'll talk a little bit about how Canadians are already engaging and pressuring Canada Pension Plan to step up. And we'll go through some of the tools we've developed, and then we'll do a Q&A. So I hope that works for everybody. And I'm just going to dive right in now. If you have any questions at all, you can put them in the chat box at the bottom and we'll try to get to them if we can. So always starting off conversations about climate with the important context, and that's the climate science here. This graph shows the concentration of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere that's increased by more than 60% in a very short period of time, primarily due to the combustion of fossil fuels, but also land use change and a few other factors. And this graph really shows what's driving that increase in CO2 in our atmosphere. The growth and the burning of coal, gas, and oil, that's carbon that was previously trapped safely in the ground and has been extracted and dumped into our atmosphere and is severely upsetting the balance, the temperature balance of our planet today. And here really is what that looks like. This graph shows temperature data from all over the world over that same period, and the impact of human-caused changes to our atmosphere are clear and measurable. So there's very straight and clear scientific consensus on the causes and the effects and even the solutions to the climate crisis that we face, and there has been for decades now. So that's sort of, I think, review for many people, but it's really good to focus on that direct link between fossil fuels and emissions and warming. And here's what that's looking like right now. Already, we're facing significant impacts to global climatic systems. So we're seeing an increased likelihood and the severity of wildfires, floods, heat waves, droughts, sea level rise, extreme weather, all of which damage the systems and ecosystems that underpin our economy. And we're also seeing changes in ecosystems in much subtler ways, which are having a big impact. So it's not just the extreme damage that we're worried about. We're also worried about shifting ecosystems and heat and cold stress, all sorts of things. We're seeing a very dramatic set of impacts, which we don't fully understand today. Some recent concrete examples on this slide of real impacts of climate change. The top left there is Hurricane Harvey flooding Houston. And that was just a few years back. And this last winter, the same city faced unprecedented cold and a cold snap, which has damaged their infrastructure in a completely opposite way. So they're really, they're facing climate impacts very directly in Texas, and it's costing billions of dollars in their economy. Top right there is a quick snapshot of Cape Town, which has been facing dramatic water shortages. The first sort of large global city to almost completely run out of water a few years ago. And I was there during the shortage, and it had a devastating impact on the way the city was operating and on tourism and on the local economy there and for people. The bottom left there is the Columbia Glacier in Alberta, which is often referred to as one of the water towers of the prairies. And it's a source of agricultural water for some of the driest parts of Canada. And it's shrinking rapidly and is expected to one day disappear as a result of global heating. So we're really seeing, very concrete examples there in Canada. The bottom right there is one of many examples in recent years from the huge increase in forest fire seasons and damage and impact. That's Fort McMurray, I think 3 summers ago. But we've seen even more dramatic forest fires in the more subsequent summers. And you can see from this slide, we've seen a very significant increase in insured catastrophic losses in Canada, many of which are directly linked to climate disruption. So, these losses are building up, and even to the right of this graph, in more recent years, we've had very substantial flooding of the Ottawa River. Many of you in the Ottawa area might have been affected by that. A lot of other examples that aren't covered here. So this is already getting very serious. And of course, there absolutely is a way out of this. There's a way of avoiding the most serious impacts of the climate crisis. And the climate science on this has been quite clear, that we have a very good chance of avoiding the worst impacts if we're able to limit the rise in global temperature to 1.5 degrees or below, which would prevent a lot of the sort of runaway impacts, the systemic impacts of climate change to ecosystems and to our food systems and to our society around the world. So this graph is incredibly important, and I always underline it as probably the most important slide I'm going to show you today. It shows us what's required to address the crisis, and we should not be talking about climate change in any context without understanding what this graph is showing us. The black line on the left there that sort of squiggles upward, that is real emissions. That's what we've already experienced. And the different lines coming down to the right show the different pathways that would be give us a reasonable chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. And as you can see, had we acted back in 2000 and started the decline then, we would have been able to have a very gentle and gradual decline in emissions, both globally and in Canada. It would have been easier. We could have, tackled this more slowly. But every year we have delayed, the curve has gotten steeper. So the required action has gotten harder. And you can see we've really been delaying for a long time. I've been working on climate change since the early 2000s, and every year we've neglected to bend that curve down. And we're now at a position where staying below 1.5 is still possible, but it's going to, really require heroic measures. So that's important to realize. There's a cost benefit in delaying action. And the second really important thing I want you to take away from this is we're not aiming to reduce emissions. That is not the goal of effective climate action. We are trying to put our society on a trajectory towards zero. And if you're not making investments and planning for zero, there's a very strong likelihood we're going to get caught, dead-ended in different ways. So the goal is not to just marginally reduce your emissions every year. If you build out and think systemically about getting our society to zero, you would make decisions in a very different way. So the rough trajectory of this is having emissions within roughly 10 years from now, and aiming for zero within 30 years. And that's quite sobering to think about. A transition of this magnitude can't just come from government policy. It's going to require a shift in where capital is invested. And that's why we actually have to stop investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure and shift into carbon-free investments right now. And that's going to be very relevant to the conversation around pensions. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about how climate change and the transition that we're going to go through to address it all create different types of financial risk. And these are really important to sort of understand, to think about when you're thinking about pension plans or shifting your own personal investments, and to think about how we can make strong arguments on the financial side of this equation. And as I mentioned before, pension funds in particular have a legal responsibility to manage these risks and to invest in your long-term best interest. So I'm going to sort of refer back to that as we go through these different buckets of risk. So yeah, physical risk, transition risk, regulatory and legal risk, and systemic risk. Yeah, before I dive into that though, there's a very strong moral case for pension funds to stop investing in coal, gas, and oil. Yeah, is this a spot, Patrick, that we should talk about? We should show the video, or is that going to come a bit later? Just trying to think about, I can't hear you, sorry.
Yeah, we can do that at the end.
Okay, we'll do it at the end. We'll show that. Yeah, so we'll just dive right into those. But to think about it this way, as I present all of these different risks, if you're a young person who's just started a new job and has just started paying into a retirement savings plan, so you say you're 25 years old, as we go through these different financial risks, is it likely that your pension fund is going to be able to pay out your pension by the time you retire in 30 years? That's the frame that's really critical to understand what the obligations of pension funds are. So first, let's talk about physical risk. I think this is quite obvious to most folks who are thinking about climate change, and we did talk through some of those. So, increased fires, floods, heat waves, droughts, sea level rise, extreme weather. They damage infrastructure that underpins our economy. They create real risks to the value of commercial real estate, utilities, infrastructure, that all make up a very significant part of Canadian pension fund holdings. They disrupt supply chains. They impact all sort of levels of manufacturing and processing and transportation. Yeah, so I'll just move on from there. We can spend a lot of time on that, but that one's fairly obvious. Transition risk is another really major category that a lot of people have started to think about quite a bit. And that's the risk that comes from the rapid transition, the actual action we're going to take to address the climate crisis. So as we make a rapid energy transition away from fossil fuels and into climate solutions, there are very definitely going to be winners and losers, and the transition will not be linear. It will be very disruptive and rapid. So we've got on this slide some examples of nonlinear transitions that have happened in our society that we can all think of that had a very substantial financial impact on winners and losers. So if you had shares in Blockbuster Video in, say, 2005, you might not have foreseen what Netflix would have done to the very profitable business model within a few short years. We've got sort of horse and buggy transition to vehicles in North America happened over about an 11-year period at the turn of the last century, previous century. And I think a really good example is a company like Kodak, which dominated the film and photography market in the late 90s and into the early 2000s, actually had a lot of the patents for digital cameras as well. They were disrupted once in that their film business completely collapsed. And then they were disrupted again when smartphones destroyed the market for digital cameras that they were producing. So those are all examples of, if you fail to foresee these rapid transitions, you can see how you can get caught out. And I can think of many different cases, and let's go through a few quickly here to do with the energy transition. This graph shows the plummeting cost of solar panels alongside the dramatic rise in installations of solar power. Let's quickly go through these. This is the drop in lithium-ion batteries, which are a big part of the electric vehicles becoming affordable and taking over from internal combustion engines. Yeah, and at the same time, we're already seeing very substantial impacts, underperformance of fossil fuel sectors, And so we can see the sort of combining of underperformance in fossil fuels and the rapid transition occurring in the next decade from these solutions is creating a real trap for anybody invested in those parts of the economy. Moving on very quickly, policy and regulatory risk. I mean, if you assume that our governments are actually going to live up to obligations around the Paris Agreement, we would expect a dramatic number of new regulations and policies coming forward, both in Canada and globally. I've already seen some of these: carbon pricing, banning internal combustion engines, retrofitting buildings so they don't use fossil gas for heating anymore, phasing out coal. All of these are sweeping currently through different parts of the energy economy in particular. And there are very substantial risks there for anybody invested in incumbent sectors. Yeah, and we're seeing these are internal combustion engine bans we've already seen announced, and there's more and more coming almost on a weekly basis now. And also there's legal and reputational risk for fossil fuel companies. So we're seeing the best way to describe it is fossil fuel companies are very much akin to tobacco companies in the 90s. They have been actively repressing policies to address the climate crisis for decades, lying about the science and the requirements, and they face very real legal and reputational risks. There are a number of growing lawsuits around the world. So think of big oil like big tobacco. There's a lot of financial risk there. And the final category I want you to sort of focus your attention on, that we always like to point out, is that there's a systemic risk from climate change that can't be limited to sort of one sector of the economy. So it's, there's no place that you could move your investments that would be safe if we don't address the overall climate crisis. The climate crisis is so existential and will have such systemic impact that the growth of economies around the world will be impacted by not addressing it. We're talking about collapses in our food system, water shortages, global security concerns, all of these sorts of things. And an example of a sort of small scale example of that are the wildfires we had in Australia before the pandemic. They were so extreme and intense that they very significantly dampened the growth of the entire Australian economy. But that's the sort of impact we expect to see globally if we don't address these risks. So you can see that investors and pension funds in particular have a very real obligation, not just to sort of defensively manage investments around climate change, but to actively be part of the solution. They have an obligation to invest in climate safety on behalf of their beneficiaries. And so we think the legal definition of their obligations means they have to address the climate crisis. And there's lots of slides here I have, which I'll just blast through, but basically they show the substantial impacts we've already seen. And on the flip side of everything I just said, I wanted to point out that the disrupting technologies that are very quickly moving into the energy space and are outcompeting fossil fuels are a very substantial financial opportunity for investors and pension funds, or anybody who has capital who wants to see it grow in the future. It better be paying attention to those opportunities and exposing their portfolios to exponential growth in renewable energy, in electrified transportation, in energy efficiency, and all of these different parts of the rapidly growing green economy. And we're already seeing the disruption of existing oil and gas and coal in markets, and the financial argument for getting out of these sectors is quite clear. We've seen dramatic underperformance of traditional energy over the last 10 years already. And you can see here, this is the S&P's energy sector compared to the rest of the S&P 500. And there's been very, very low growth, as there are a lot of competing fossil fuel producers, but not as dramatic growth in demand globally. And that's expected to pick up. So the downturn we saw with COVID-19 impacting oil prices, for example, is just a taste of what's about to come for fossil fuel companies over the next 10 years, as climate action does the same thing in destroying demand for fossil fuels. We can see, again, another example. These are the cleanest 5 global utilities, electrical utilities, competing against the 5 dirtiest. And those that have invested in renewable energy storage, and all of these new parts of the energy economy are thriving, and those that haven't are underperforming. So it really matters for the future. So global finance is waking up to a lot of what I just talked about. And it's now moving at a pace that's exceeded the capacity of finance institutions to understand this. So they're all now aware that they have to do something on climate change, but the literacy on these issues is very low. And we're seeing a lot of announcements from different finance institutions like banks and pension funds around climate change, but not a lot of the sort of fine details. But this is a letter from Larry Fink, the president of BlackRock, the CEO of BlackRock, the world's largest money manager and institutional investor, saying we're fundamentally changing how we make investments based on climate change. This is 2 years ago. And this year, BlackRock actually said to all of the companies, this letter from this year, they told all of the companies they invest in that they need to see clear climate risk disclosure and a sense that they have a transition plan on the books. And there's the implication that major investors may actually divest of companies that don't disclose those or have a credible transition pathway. So this is a real panic, I think, in some cases sweeping through financial institutions. And even then, I would say BlackRock is not considered a leader in this space, but they're highly influential. So it's a symptom of all of the people and companies that BlackRock, they manage money for other people. And all of those people have been calling on them to step up and do something about climate. So this is the direct result of pressure from stakeholders. Which brings us to the Canadian pensions. And I'll quickly talk through the slide, and then I'll kick it over to Patrick to sort of get more into the details around Canada Pension Plan. But quickly, I just want to give you the high-level overview. The 10 largest pension funds, so these are for public sector employees, largely in Canada, have almost $1.8 trillion under management. And that's money that actually belongs to the workers, Canadian workers, who've worked their whole careers and have saved their money, and they've been handed over to these money managers. They actually manage the funds on behalf of these groups of professionals. So if you're Canadian and living outside of Quebec, you're automatically a member. If you've been working an age over 18, I think it is, and you've been working, you're automatically paying into the Canada Pension Plan. Or if you're in Quebec, the Quebec Pension Plan, which is managed by the Caisse de dépôt, which also manages a number of other large public pension plans in Quebec. And yeah, we can talk through some of these other ones, but there are large ones for most provinces and different categories of retirees, but they are amongst them, across all of them, some of the largest institutional investors on a global scale. So I won't go through all of the sort of details of the Canadian pension model, but it's just important to remember that these are private investment firms essentially working on behalf of workers to invest their funds. So they're actively investing on our behalf. And so the pension beneficiaries, the people whose actual money it is, have quite a bit of power to ask their pension managers to invest responsibly on their behalf. And that's where the engagement we're talking about comes in. So it is very possible for Canadians to influence how these pension funds operate. So I'll kick it over to you, Patrick, now, if that makes sense. And you can
thanks, Adam.
jump in.
I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive on the Canada Pension Plan right now, because every working and retired Canadian is a member of that funds. I know some of you might be members of some of the other big pension funds. And I would remind you that we do have similar data for those funds as we do for CPP, but just to be inclusive for the purpose of this presentation, we'll dive into CPP. And I'm going to try to fly through this in less than 10 minutes. So we have some time for a good discussion, but Adam and I are both around to stick on the call till about 2:15 if there's any additional questions. And I think that we want to show a video that we worked on for the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan later on as well. So I'll try to leave some time for that. But over to CPP, this is our national pension fund for over 20 million Canadians. It's the largest fund in Canada. So it has about $475 billion in assets under management. And just to put this in perspective, that's like the entire GDP of a medium-sized country like Nigeria or Argentina or Belgium. That's how large this pool of capital is now. And it's not just like any savings account or RSP. They actually own large parts of the real physical economy. So they own ports and toll highways, entire global companies, entire blocks of downtown real estate and global financial centers, highways, airports, utilities. They're just a massive player in the real economy. And that means they have global influence to actually shape the direction of that economy. Next slide, please, Adam. A bit of the good that CPP is doing, they actually are using a range of internal tools now to assess environmental, social, and governance factors across their portfolios. They're a founding member of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, so they're actually beginning to disclose some of the climate-related risks associated with the portfolio that Adam went over in the beginning of this presentation. They've embedded climate risk analysis across their governance structure. They've begun measuring the carbon footprints of most of their portfolio, and they've also started analyzing what different climate scenarios mean for those investments. So what might 2 degrees warming mean for their investments? What might 3 degrees warming mean? 1.5 scenario, what does that do to the growth of the funds? And like many other investors, they've recognized renewable energy and other clean technology and climate solutions as profitable. So they put $1 billion into green bonds in 2019. They bought one of North America's largest solar and wind developers, Pattern Energy, for $2.3 billion US last year. And just in December, they launched their own renewable energy platform that will allow them to develop their own projects in Europe in particular, but also in the US. So they've recognized renewable energy as a growth sector. And if Adam goes to the next slide there, this is from their last annual report. It shows the massive growth they have in their renewable energy investments from almost nothing back in 2016 to about $6.5 billion in 2020. And that's actually up to over $9 billion now in renewable energy over the last couple of months. So they really do see this as an opportunity for growth and are plowing ahead in renewable energy investments. Next slide, please, Adam. However, the good news kind of stops there. There is a real lack of transparency and disclosure with this fund, like other Canadian pension funds. Even though we spend a lot of our time tracking these investments and digging through annual reports and sustainable investment reports, we actually can't tell you a simple, clear number on how big CPP's fossil fuel investments are. We estimate it's at least $12 billion invested in fossil fuel companies, and it's probably more than that if you consider all of the oil, gas, and coal companies that are exposed through other parts of their portfolio. All of those tools I mentioned before, carbon footprinting and scenario analysis and ESG factoring, we don't actually know what they're doing with them. So they're announcing that they're using them, but we're not sure how they're actually factoring into investment decision-making and influencing the portfolio and what they do with some of the companies, stocks, and assets they hold. They're diversified across the fossil fuel sector, so utilities, pipelines, refineries, oil, gas, and coal. They have big oil sands holdings. And we're actually seeing the impact of these fossil fuel investments. Between 2019 and 2020, their energy and resources portfolio, which is heavily tilted toward fossil fuels, saw a loss of 23.4% that year. That's partially because of COVID, but COVID was just accelerating the trends of these being bad investments in fossil fuels last year. So we're actually seeing in real time that these investments are having negative impacts on Canadians' pension savings. Next slide, please, Adam. The really ugly in this portfolio. I'm going to talk about Neffin Energy in Ireland and Crestone Peak Resources in Colorado. So just park that for a couple of minutes. I'll go to a next slide on that. But a report last week showed they have about $1.2 billion invested in global coal companies. It came out in testimony from the CPP itself to the House of Commons Finance Committee last year that they have about $141 million in Chinese coal companies. These oil gas coal company investments are completely out of step with both the Paris Agreement goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and Canada's own weaker climate commitments. So there's no actually alignments with the CPP's investments in our own climate targets. They've been quite intransigent on any discussion of moving away from fossil fuels and putting in place a strong climate policy. And it's very difficult to amend the CPPIB Act, which is the legislation that governs our national pension funds. It's actually more difficult to change this act than it is to change Canada's constitution. So there's not a whole lot of push for legislative action on this right now. Next slide, please. I mentioned a couple of examples. I'll go through a couple of these. Crestone Peak Resources. This is a fracking company that's almost completely owned by CPP, by our pension funds, that's based in Denver, Colorado. CPP bought this back in 2015, and they also have fund managers from CPP on the board and executive team of this company. So they're actually directly involved in the day-to-day operations of Crestone Peak. What happened with this company? We saw a huge amount of complaints to Colorado's oil and gas regulator due to Crestone. Stuff like illnesses and breathing problems, poor air quality, worker injuries. Some of the fracking wells were causing earthquakes. There was toxic fumes spewing from them. In some cases, there was explosions. There was more complaints to Colorado's regulator about this company than the next four largest fracking companies combined in Colorado. What really came up in the States was Crestone was found to be drilling wells next to schools, playgrounds, and houses. And this obviously created quite a public backlash. So some counties in Colorado moved to try to put a moratorium on new fracking wells. They also pushed for a statewide ban on fracking as well. Where it really came out was that they pushed for a setback of fracking wells from places like schools, playgrounds, and other community places. And instead of actually cleaning up its act and either reducing its fracking activity or meeting these setback requirements, Crestone responded by plowing about $660,000 US into state elections in Colorado in 2020 to support pro-fracking candidates and other super PACs and interest groups. So they were actually using pension money that they say came from the operations of the company to actually try to influence Colorado politics to prevent regulations on fracking. And this came out in the Globe Mail back in the fall, and I think a lot of Canadians would be shocked to hear that their pension fund is operating a company that's participating in these kind of activities. Next slide, please, Adam. The other example I'll give is Neffin Energy. This is an offshore oil and gas producer that CPP bought from Shell back in 2017 for about 830 million euros. It's actually now Ireland's biggest producer of natural gas. However, its prospects for growth are pretty much null now because the Irish government, out of concern for climate change and listening to public opposition to offshore drilling, has put a ban on new offshore oil drilling, and they're going to be putting a ban on offshore gas drilling soon, probably later this year in the next couple of months. So this just means that there's no prospects for growth of this investment that CPP made on our behalf. And I just want to bring out these two examples because I think they really illustrate the kind of financial risks that Adam was talking about earlier in this presentation, whether it's regulatory, whether it's reputational, or whether it's from the physical risks of climate change. These are really two examples that drive home how we think that pension funds are not really getting it yet. It needs to improve it big time. Next slide, please, Adam. Like I said, CPP has been quite intransigent about putting in place a strong internal climate policy. A couple of quotes here, I'm not going to read them, but I think they just demonstrate that they don't really understand the nature of climate change and the fact that we really need to immediately drive down emissions and stop investing in fossil fuel expansion and the infrastructure that supports it, which they continue to do. We need to see an alignment of their portfolios with the Paris Agreement. We need to see targets for net zero and how they get there. And we just need to see an acknowledgement that there's no space for any kind of fossil fuel expansion in order to maintain a safe climate. And some of the recent media statements suggest that they don't get this, that they seem to think that oil and gas is going to play a role in expansion during this transition. And we know from the science that that can't happen. And we actually find, next slide please, Adam, we actually find their position on fossil fuel divestment a little bit contradictory, because some of you folks might remember the story back in 2019 when it came out that there's a couple of private prison companies in the US that were detaining migrants and their families, including children, at the US-Mexico border. It came out that CPP had millions of dollars invested in these private prison companies, and within days, they had divested of these stocks because of public outrage. So I think this kind of suggests that there actually is room for them to be moved by particularly heinous investments and actions that are offside with Canadians. And that's part of the pressure we're trying to bring to the candidate pension plan. Next slide, please, Adam. Some of the things we're doing on CPP as well as other funds, we have an action tool. So if you go to shiftyourpension.ca, you can send a letter directly to different pension fund managers. We've been setting up meetings with CPP staff as well as the staff of other pension funds. We do ongoing monitoring of pension fund energy investments and other high carbon assets that they own or buy or sell. We have a climate action toolkit for CPP and other big pension funds that we could share if you're interested. Back in October, the CPP was mandated to hold biannual public meetings, and we helped drive out Canadians to those meetings. And we actually saw in meetings across the country that climate change was the #1 issue and question that came up when they had a chance to participate in those meetings. We're doing a lot of media work to raise a profile of this issue of these pension funds' risky fossil fuel investments. And we're producing some videos and trying to amplify this message on social media. So this next slide just shows some of the media work we've done on CPP. You might have seen some of our work on other pension funds as well. And then like I mentioned, we're working on other pension funds. A couple quick notes here on some other high profile ones. So BCI, which is the pension fund manager for public sector in British Columbia, we estimate that they have about $6 billion in fossil fuel investments. That's from a 2016 study by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. AIMCO, the big Alberta pension fund manager, just last year, they bought a 65% stake in the Coastal GasLink pipeline, the pipeline through BC that would export fracked gas from the port of Kitimat. And obviously, we saw huge protests over Indigenous rights about that last year in particular. That's owned by Alberta's pension funds. Ontario Teachers, we estimate about $8 billion in fossil fuel investments that they have. In June 2020, they joined a consortium to buy a $10 billion stake in the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company's gas pipeline network. And then on Christmas Eve last year, they bought a 70% stake in Italy's second largest gas pipeline network. So we're seeing these massive gas investments from Ontario Teachers. And then OMERS, the big fund for municipal employees in Ontario, we estimate at least $2.3 billion in fossil fuel investments. And with some of those other big funds I mentioned, they actually own a utility in Washington State called Puget Sound Energy that's actively lobbying to try and prevent a ban on natural gas hookups in new buildings. So actively lobbying to prevent climate action that's necessary to avoid climate disruption. I think I'll leave it at that. Like I said, if you go to shiftyourpension.ca, you can send a letter to the CPP or another pension fund you're part of. And this slide here at the end, just one more there, Adam. I just like to kind of put this out there to illustrate how impactful it is to shift money away from fossil fuels and into climate solutions. All those things on the left, becoming a vegetarian or flying less or buying an electric vehicle. I try to do those things in my own life. They're all good to reduce our own personal footprints. But as far as emissions reduction impact goes, we can have a huge impact if we actually move our own money and move these massive pools of capital in our pension funds into climate solutions and away from fossil fuels. So this image just kind of gets across that level of ambition that we need from the finance sector in Canada to achieve the Paris Agreement targets. And before we get into Q&A, we had a request to show this video that we made with Fridays for Future Toronto about the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. It features students in Ontario calling on teachers to get their pension out of fossil fuels. So I think we're going to play that if we still have time. Maybe I'll ask our host if we still have time for that. It's about 4 minutes long. I think we're good. So let's roll with it, and then we'll do some Q&A after.
From Oakville. I'm Alia from Toronto. I'm Gabby. I'm Catherine.
I'm Andy from Unionville, Ontario.
My name is Megan. I'm Isabel from Ottawa. I'm Sophie Krause, and I'm from Grimsby, Ontario.
My name is Nave, and I'm from Toronto.
Dear Ontario teachers, we're speaking to you as your students, young people from across Ontario who are terrified of the future that awaits us if the world fails to urgently act to tackle the climate crisis.
We're calling on you to step up and take action now on one place where you have real power, your pension fund.
The Ontario Teachers Pension Plan must stop investing your money in climate failure.
If we have any hope of stabilizing the climate in our lifetimes, the science shows that we must cut carbon pollution in half in less than 10 years. Oil, gas, and coal must stay safely in the ground.
We know how hard you work to prepare us for the challenges of the future. We see this hard work every day in our classrooms, school clubs, and activities, and we will always be thankful for that.
But unfortunately, your pension savings are being invested in oil, coal, and gas corporations that are taking away the livable climate and clean energy future we urgently need.
The Ontario Teachers Pension Plan continues to pour billions of dollars of your retirement savings into the worst polluters that are fueling the climate crisis.
Oil sands producers, fracking companies, pipelines, and even the coal industry.
Investments that profit from the climate crisis are immoral and jeopardize our future, students and teachers alike. They're also a risky financial decision.
Can you understand what it's like to learn that our teachers' pension contributions are being used to finance corporations and infrastructures that directly undermine our future?
Your pension fund managers have a fiduciary duty to invest in the best interests for working and retired teachers, a legal obligation to address the worsening of the climate crisis to protect you and your retirement savings.
Your pension fund has already divested from companies that produce and sell harmful tobacco, guns, and weapons, as the moral and financial risks outweigh the return. Fossil fuel companies must be added to this list.
Securing a livable planet for our future also requires massive new investments in zero carbon solutions, like renewable energy, green buildings, sustainable agriculture, and clean technology. Your pension plan is not investing enough in climate solutions.
Teachers,
We're calling on you to stand up for our collective future and take action now.
Please.
Please.
Call on the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan to align your money with a livable climate. Here's how.
Stop new investments in oil, gas, and coal immediately.
Phase out all current investments in oil, gas, and coal by 2025.
Set ambitious targets for increased investments in profitable climate solutions.
invest in companies that help build a zero carbon economy right here in Ontario.
There is nothing radical here. This is simply what is required to secure a safe climate future for us and a healthy retirement for you.
Ontario teachers, you are our best ally.
You support us, get us through school, go above and beyond every day to give us the skills and knowledge needed to excel. You're there for us when we need it most. We're hitting the streets and screaming at the top of our lungs at politicians, corporations, and world leaders to listen to the science. We need you to help us now by investing in our future.
Tell the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan to stop investing your retirement savings in climate failure.
With love and hope,
Your students,
The students.
Your students,
your students from across Ontario.
Okay. And with that, we can wrap up our presentation and move on to questions.
Okay, thanks, Patrick and Adam. A great presentation, incredibly informative. I'm sure everyone learned quite a bit, unfortunately. Well, probably unfortunately. First of all, great video. How long ago did you put that together?
We put that together in December and released it in the first week of January.
And how is it doing? Is it resonating? Are you getting any?
Yeah, it was covered in the Toronto Star, and the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan itself reacted to it as well, and it got a huge play, and we noticed a huge uptick in the number of teachers that contacted us and started signing our action tools as results of that video.
Oh, great! Well, congratulations. Very powerful to have many very articulate young people. It's always a delight to see. Just a couple of questions from the audience. First, someone just wanted a clarification on, Cecile Wilson wanted clarification on zero versus net zero.
Yeah, yeah, I can address that. That's quite a complicated question, but yeah, it's a huge problem right now. So I'll explain that graph I showed earlier in the presentation that showed the trajectory of what we need to get to. It points towards zero emissions. That the steepness of that curve is so great that it's very likely that there will be some sectors of the global economy which we might not be able to get to zero quite quickly enough. Areas like agriculture or some sectors, or in some cases, some developing countries in the global south that have development requirements, we might not be able to get them off fossil fuels quite quickly enough. So there's been a recognition that we may need the net part at a global scale, which means we may have to find ways of removing some carbon from the atmosphere down the line. So that's sort of it's an active discussion. It's a raging debate within the scientific community about what's going to be required there. What that doesn't mean is that countries like Canada that are wealthy and developed, or companies or investors really get access to the net part of that conversation. They should not be trying to use offsets to continue extracting and burning fossil fuels unnecessarily. So that's why for the investors, for the companies that we're talking about, zero is the appropriate trajectory for them. And net zero is sort of providing that broader framework. So that's how I'd frame it.
Thank you. Marilyn was asking whether what the gender ratio was on the CC Canadian Pension Plan Board of Investment Board. You know,
I'd have to look again at that, to be honest. I don't have that off the tip of my. But looking at the boards of most pension funds is definitely not gender balanced. There's definitely, like boards everywhere in our society, very male dominated, and as well dominated by older generations as well. So it's sort of older, male boards typically. But the Canada Pension Plan Board is also has a regional breakdown. So the way that the board members are appointed is linked to provincial as well. So there's a number of considerations we haven't been able to quite tease out as to how they appoint board members.
Patrick, I was curious on how independent the Canadian Pension Board is. Like, they obviously have some connection with the federal government, but how independent are they? And for example, like when the federal government wants to build a pipeline, are they leaning on the CCP to invest in the Trans Mountain, or they cannot do that? What's your understanding of that?
No, the CPP is completely independent of the federal government. It's a crown corporation, but it's arm's length and managed by a completely independent investment manager. That being said, there's a lot of research from the CCPA actually that shows a lot of overlap between the Canada Pension Plan's board and executive staff and oil and gas companies. So just like throughout corporate Canada, there's a lot of overlap between members of boards of companies, of large corporations, who are also on the boards of some of these pension funds. So there is some overlap on the back ends, but politically it is completely sealed off from any kind of influence from Canadian politics. And that's arguably a good thing, because we shouldn't, have a pension fund being decided just by the flavor of the day in politics. And I think it is a good thing that we have an independent board that's separate from the federal government. I'm not sure if Adam has anything to add to that question.
I think you folks have pointed out that the CCP has made some progress. I was at something at the Progress Summit about 3 years ago, and they were, the head of the CCP was there, and he seemed to be just giving lip service at the most to shifting towards green investments, but it looks like they are starting to shift in a somewhat serious way.
Yeah, I can speak to the what they are starting to shift, and it's because the financial argument has really come around, where the parts of their portfolio that are growing have been clean energy. So there's been this global rush to clean energy investment.
What I don't understand, Adam, is why, when the energy sector, the fossil fuel sector, has been doing so badly for year after year after year, and we just had the bank track people on Fire Your Fossil Bank last week on the show, and the banks, of course, are still madly investing in fossil fuels, and bank track seems to be able to track all that, I guess, better than the pension plans. Why in the world, when they're such a bad bet, and especially with Paris and where everyone's heading, why are they still investing so heavily in fossil fuels? I don't get it. It doesn't seem to be using their fiduciary responsibility correctly at all.
Yeah, the best answer I can give to that is there's an entanglement of fossil fuels with all of our institutions in Canada. We're living in a small country, relatively speaking. The business community is small. There are a lot of if you're moving jobs within a sector, say in finance, there's a very good chance that you know people personally, or you're moving from jobs into different sectors. So the banks in particular have for a long time made a lot of money lending into fossil fuels. And so they know people there. And in the pension plans, a lot of the executives actually will end up sitting as board members on fossil fuel companies, or vice versa. So there's a revolving door between oil and gas in particular in Canada and the finance space. And that seems to be a big part of this. It's a cultural problem as much as it is any other problem, where it's impolite to say negative things about fossil fuels. And the way that if we say, you really need to phase out your investments in this sector for climate reasons, they'll say, no, we need to be there to support this industry through the transition, which it's a nonsensical statement, because the transition is away from an energy transition is by definition away from fossil fuels. But there's this idea that we need to be helping in part of that sector.
We had Donald Gutstein on talking about the big stall a few weeks ago, and he goes through in his book, of course, as you probably would know, intimate details of the endless connections between the oil and gas industry and financial, and just throughout Canada. But surely, when the returns are so bad, I always thought that's what drove these managers to keep investing in fossil fuels, was good returns. But the returns, when you look at the S&P 500 over the last decade going up 170% or something, and the fossil energy sector going up 6%, how can you continue to be compelled to invest in that? I don't get it.
It's partly the stories that they tell themselves. And we hear this every day in the Canadian media, and we hear this, especially if you attend business events. There's always this narrative that the industry puts out to try to continue the business as usual. So they say, oh, well, there's a strong pathway for us to reduce emissions, and our environmental performance improves all the time. And they talk about somehow hydrogen is going to save this sector, which it couldn't possibly do that, or carbon capture and storage, which has not been proved to be commercially viable and has been really a dud in many ways. somehow magically will protect the industry, or there's always this magical thinking, a very PR sort of communications approach to telling a story that makes it seem like there's a future there. And the literacy on climate science is still very low in the financial sector in Canada, to the point where it's not well understood, where this is going. And
well,
so
I think whenever you see this, both the commitment to 2050 to zero emissions is a red flag for greenwashing, but also the idea of net zero versus zero emissions. They all are thinking, if they think net zero, that means, oh, we could have 30 or 40% of emissions just covered off by growing more trees in Zambia or something, or we can do all this carbon capture or all kinds of other things. So we really don't have to reduce our emissions anything like what the IPCC is saying, I think is the thing. Patrick, do you want to comment on that at all?
No, I'll wait till the next question.
Okay. Rolly, did you want to ask a question or ask a...
Yes, I will actually. Let me just open something up here. Yes, I have a couple of questions of my own, really, but I think they might touch on some of the questions that have already been asked. One of the things, as you both know, Adam and Patrick, I'm involved in a group, we're calling it the Fossil Bank Group, where we're trying to raise the awareness of people who use our banks on how their money is being used by the banks to finance fossil fuels and climate change. So in the pension sector, how would you rate pensioners and also contributors to pension funds? How would you rate their knowledge or their interest actually in how their money is being used by fund managers, whether it's CPP or OMERS, to which I belong? So on a scale of 1 to 10, are Canadians 3% knowledgeable or 3? So what's your estimate of where Canadians stand on that?
You want to take that one, Patrick?
Yeah, sure. I actually think that's, a lot of Canadians don't have a pension, for one thing, so that kind of shrinks the pool of supporters we have for this campaign. But even among those that do have pensions, I think their level of knowledge about this is quite low. It's not something that they think of. It's not something that's obvious, even for people that really care about climate action. And in these kind of times of economic anxiety, I think just having the pension is enough, and they don't really think about what it's being invested in. But we do find once we do open up that conversation about what it's being invested in, and not just on fossil fuels, but on weapons companies, or a big issue that's come up this year is long-term care with the PSP Invest, the big federal pension fund. They actually really are concerned about the way their money is being used to invest in various unethical practices and industries. So I really think this is the first step is just awareness raising, and kind of building that knowledge of the power that people have with their pension funds, because when they figure it out, they really do care, I think.
So I think the messaging is very similar with with the banking industry, that people who have accounts with the big five can use their money as a weapon, really, to influence banks to change their modus operandi, if you wish. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do in that area for sure. The second question is, if I'm interested, for example, I spoke that I'm a member of OMERS. What process have you followed in order to research these different pension funds, and and how much data do you have? I think you alluded to that a while ago, that you have similar kind of information for individual pension funds as you do for CPP, but I'm just wondering if you can elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll take the first shot of that, Adam. Data is actually quite scarce. There's no reporting requirements in Canada the way there is in other countries to list, all of the assets and equities in different portfolios that these funds are invested in. So we've spent a lot of our time digging through annual reports, responsible investing reports. There's a database that's managed by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission that requires investors to list all of the companies they have shares in on the U.S. stock exchanges. Different reports from other think tanks we gather from, and then just constant kind of monitoring of the media, press releases, news reports of some of the different investments these funds have. We're discovering new ones all the time that kind of slip through our fingers, but I think we've managed to kind of build up a pretty good inventory of all the publicly available information that's out there about these Canadian pension funds at this point. But it hasn't been easy, and they definitely don't make it easy to give their beneficiaries that information.
So are you the, I guess this is the first, like Shift Action is the first in Canada on pension fund research. Are you becoming the bank track of the pension industry in Canada? I hope you are.
We're working on it, but we don't have the resources quite at that scale to do it.
Sure.
There are other groups, Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives and the Corporate Mapping Project, and some other academics have all taken cracks at trying to build a bit of a database of what's available. But one of the other ways that we're able to get some of this information is the beneficiaries themselves asking that question. It really opens the door as to why the pension funds have been hiding some of this information. They're not forthcoming unless asked. So the process of actually engaging the fund and saying, how are you investing my money, please? Can you tell me? Has really actually unlocked some of this information for us. So yeah, we're not quite bank track with huge data tables yet, but we are building towards it.
Good. By the way, I haven't received an answer from OMERS yet. I did find your letter to my pension fund, but I will pursue. And there was a question about whether you provide financial advice on who to invest with. I think I know the answer to that, but you might want to cover that off.
Yeah, we are not financial advisors. We're not, especially when it comes to personal finance. So we steer clear of recommending specific investments. What we will say is that investing without having your investments put into fossil fuels is entirely possible and doable. And there are lots of experts and a growing number of them out there who can guide you on that. So if you ask your financial advisor to do that for you and they say no or try to talk you out of it, there's a big red flag right there that you need to be talking to somebody else. And so,
that happens a lot, by the way.
Yeah. So we can maybe in the chat, we can throw a couple names out, but there are multiple names and we don't want to focus you too many on just one person. But if you look for carbon-free investing or fossil-free investing or other sort of ethical investing categories, there are a growing number of financial experts who can guide you.
Adam, I just wanted to ask quickly whether, so all of these 10 largest pension funds, none of them have transparency as to what they're invested in? That's just this modus operandi for these? Well, even though they're controlling this remarkable amounts of our money, we have no idea literally what they're actually investing in as a de facto?
Yeah, I mean, there's no requirement that they disclose it. So they do occasionally, they'll sometimes put a press release out when they make a new investment. Sometimes they list companies if they want to brag about the activities of something they own on their website. So they do sometimes list them, but there's no comprehensive list or the valuation of their holdings at any given time you can have access to. So we have only visibility into their public equities. So anything that they own directly in the stock market, they actually file in the US on the Edgar database, and we can actually see their holdings from last quarter. That's the best visibility we have, but they're private investors primarily. So they have 60% of 70% of their holdings in some cases are privately held companies, and we don't have the comprehensive list of those companies. We don't know what they're worth. And we really have to work hard to understand the complete sort of picture of the portfolio.
We're just about out of time. I just want to get a quick answer to a different question. I was reading an article yesterday where they were worried about these big investment firms, banks, pension plans, whatever, now shifting, and if they do stop investing in fossil fuels, that they shift it to agriculture and the beef industry and a whole other range of climate problems if they move into the high carbon agriculture investing. I was wondering if you just any advice on that, Patrick, or whether you're taking that into consideration or you're just staying with the fossil fuels.
Yeah, I mean, our work has been quite focused on fossil fuel holdings at this point, but we are collecting information on other sectors of the economy. So for example, there are climate risks associated with basically any sector, whether it's agriculture or automobiles. They have different types of climate risks associated with them. And I think that the pension funds themselves are actually struggling to find data to help them understand where to put that money. They might be very good at kind of those traditional risk metrics in finance, but they don't actually have the tools yet to identify the different varying levels of climate risk for other industries and package them into an investment product that they can actually put their money into. And I think they need a little help with that, and they're kind of reckoning with that challenge right now.
Thank you for that. Last quick question. I'll try and get a short answer to, again, a tough question. Jill Marzetti asks, are there any numbers that show the profitability of the non-carbon energy companies?
Yeah, it's quite a complicated question. I think we can say there's a clear and growing trend now that in the energy sector, we're starting to see an outperformance of low carbon energy sectors specifically. We've seen a real, especially with COVID, that has accelerated this trend. We've seen companies like NextEra, which is one of the world's largest wind energy developers, eclipsing the market capitalization of large oil and gas companies at a global scale. So we have lots of different data points that point to this trend, but it's not as clear cut as it, it's quite complex. You'd have to look at the different sectors and the different companies, but we're at a point now where renewable energy is actually cheaper. Installing new solar power, for example, is cheaper than operating an existing coal plant in most jurisdictions. That's just one example. And we're finding these in all different parts of the energy economy. So profitability potential for clean energy is far higher and the risks are far lower than in traditional energy.
Well, I think we're going to have to close it up here. It's been a great session, very informative. Rolly, where are we going here? Rolly, do you want to talk, or Kathleen? What are we going to do here?
I'll tell about next week, and then Rolly can finish up with the global climate strike information. So have you got the poster for next week?
Yeah, I'll put it up.
Okay, great. Oh, by the way, thanks for giving me this promotion. I've really enjoyed listening from afar rather than being a participant.
Oh, you bureaucrats.
Nothing like rising to the top. You do less. Okay, next week we're going to have 2 Indigenous leaders who will answer questions that should help all of us understand the history of this country better. I've been doing some research and I can't believe how ignorant I am about Indigenous history and what we've done to our First Nations, Métis and Inuit. So we're going to ask things like, why were certain treaties signed 300 years ago and less in certain parts of the country? I must say, I hear about unceded and treaty, and we're going to have that straightened out. What was in Canada's 1867 Constitution? What promises were made to Indigenous people then? How many of us know? Also, how has the Indian Act been harmful to Canadians, in our Indigenous communities? For example, I found out that there were a lot of Indigenous farmers in the West, and the Indian Act made it illegal for them to own farm implements. So they were neutralized. And also, how did Stephen Harper's policies, he was a mean SOB, lead to the Idle No More movement? I'd like to know more about that. Are the Liberals sincere when they use words and phrases like nation to nation and reconciliation? Our guests will say a definite no. Find out about that. We'll also look at Bill C-15, which is now going through the House of Commons right now. And it's an act respecting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So this should be very relevant and interesting. So please join us next week, because the 2 speakers we have really been leaders, and I hate to say it, but they've stuck their necks out and even had opposition from various angles and have usually been proven right with their warnings and their analyses. So hope to see you next week, and over to you, Rolly.
And you were going to put up the poster for next week's webinar. You want to just put it up for a second, and then we'll move on to the global.
You see it there, Rolly? I've got it up. I hope it's up.
I do not.
Oh, no.
Okay, well, you want to just show the poster for the global climate strike?
Yeah, I've got it playing. I hope it's up.
Okay.
Is anyone seeing that?
No.
Oh, no. Maybe I have to take back the.
Well, I'll just speak to it.
Oh,
then.
here. Sorry. Let me try again here.
Okay.
See it now?
Yes. Yes, that's one of them. So yeah, so just very quickly, on March 19th, a little bit over a week from now, both globally and across Canada, students will be youth, I guess, will be taking action again. And this time they're calling again on the fossil fuel industry, they're calling on the banks and insurance company, and they're calling on all of us, or they're calling on all of these carbon actors, banks, and again, the fossil fuel industry, as well as pension funds and insurance companies, to act on your sort of a hashtag act on your promises, hashtag no more empty promises. So that's one of the posters. This one is for Fridays for Future Ottawa. And if you scroll up the chat before we sign up, you're going to find several links which I've shared. One for if you're living in the Ottawa area, Fridays for Future Ottawa. There's a local event going on, corner of Spark Street in Elgin. Next slide, Ken. Next image.
Got it there?
We're having some technical issues. There's also, of course, a link in your chat for the global climate strike Canada-wide, as well as, if we can get the links up, not the link, you have the links, but if we can get the images up. If not, again, please just check the links, and you have all the information you require to support our youth in their next global action. And again, Canada-wide on March the 19th. That's fine, Ken. I provided the links. Apologies for the technical issue.
Okay, I think we should end it here. I'd like to thank Patrick and Adam for a very informative session. I'm thrilled you two of my favorite climate activists are busy doing this pension thing. I think it's a really leveraged activity that I think are going to have great success with. I don't know about you guys, but I think you're really on to something very important. So I'd like to, on behalf of everyone who was here, I'd like to thank you too for taking the time to share the great work you're doing.
Thanks for having us. Really.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll leave it at that.